Imagine waking up one day and realizing you've been losing battles you never agreed to fight. Not the dramatic kind. No collapsing empires, no enemies at the gate. Just the quiet kind. The moment you open your phone and your mood is instantly dictated by a headline you didn't choose. The casual comment from someone you barely respect that still manages to puncture your confidence for hours. The strange exhaustion that comes from doing everything right, yet feeling like your life is somehow slipping through your fingers like sand. You sit up in bed and the room looks normal. Same ceiling. Same light leaking through the curtains. Same version of you, technically alive, technically functioning. But something feels wrong in a way you can't name. It's not sadness exactly. It's not fear either. It's the unsettling suspicion that you are not the one steering. Because if you're honest, you've felt it for a long time. How easily you are pulled. How quickly your attention is hijacked. How one small inconvenience can infect your entire day like poison. How your mind can become a courtroom where every thought prosecutes you, and you keep showing up without a lawyer. And you start asking yourself the question that most people avoid because it's too dangerous, too intimate, too revealing. If I'm not in control of my own mind, then who is? Look around. Everyone talks about winning. Winning at work, winning in relationships, winning at money, status, attraction, influence. The world sells you strategies like they're weapons, confidence hacks, productivity systems, charisma tricks, negotiation tactics. It all sounds sharp and powerful. It all sounds like victory. Yet the strangest thing keeps happening. People win and still feel hollow. They get the promotion and feel nothing. They get the applause and feel exposed. They get the relationship and start sabotaging it. They get the money and suddenly their mind becomes a haunted house, filled with new fears, new comparisons, new reasons it's not enough. So what is it really? How can someone have the world in their hands and still be losing inside their own head? And if that's possible, what does it say about the way you've been chasing success? Here's the paradox that should make your stomach tighten. The life you want is often destroyed not by what happens to you, but by what happens inside you in response. Two people face the same rejection. One grows sharper, calmer, more focused. The other collapses into bitterness and self-doubt. Two people receive the same criticism. One extracts the lesson and becomes stronger. The other spirals for days, replaying the moment like a punishment ritual. Two people stand in the same traffic, the same delay, the same inconvenience. Yet one stays sovereign and the other becomes a slave to rage. So what's the difference? Was it luck, personality, childhood, genetics? Or is there something else, something more unsettling? A hidden skill the world doesn't reward at first because it's invisible, but without it, every reward turns into a trap. Now imagine this. You're in a room full of people and nobody is yelling. Nobody is attacking you, but you still feel small. Why? Because your mind is narrating a story you didn't consciously choose. It's scanning faces for signs of disapproval. It's remembering old embarrassments with perfect clarity. It's predicting failure with the confidence of a prophet. Nothing is happening, yet everything is happening. You are not being harmed, yet you are bleeding internally. And that's when the question deepens into something almost spiritual. What if the real battlefield of daily life isn't your job, your goals, or your circumstances, but your own attention? Because attention is life. Where your attention goes, your life follows. Your attention decides what you worship, what you fear, what you become. And most people live as if their attention is public property. They give it away to notifications, to other people's opinions, to old regrets, to imaginary futures, to the endless internal noise that pretends it's you, even when it's clearly not your ally. But once in a while, you encounter a different kind of person, someone who doesn't flinch when they're provoked, someone who doesn't chase validation like oxygen, someone who can be surrounded by chaos and still move with quiet precision, like their soul has a locked door. They speak less. They react slower. They don't seem hypnotized by the same social games. They can lose something and remain intact. They can be insulted and remain calm. They can be praised and remain grounded. And you wonder, half in admiration, half in suspicion, what do they know that I don't? Marcus Aurelius, an emperor sitting at the center of power, wrote as if he understood a brutal truth most of us still refuse to face. You can conquer nations and still be conquered by your own impulses. You can rule the world and still be ruled by your mood. You can wear the crown and still live like a captive. So here is the great question you must answer, not as philosophy but as survival. If the outer world will never stop testing you, will you keep living as a reflex, or will you become the kind of person who cannot be possessed? Because daily life is not just a schedule. It is a psychological arena, and whether you realize it or not, you are being trained every day either into mastery or into surrender. The terrifying part is that both paths feel normal while you're on them. And if you're not careful, you will wake up years from now with achievements on paper and a mind that still isn't yours. So before we talk about winning, success, confidence, power, before any of that, there's something you need to see. Something hidden beneath your habits, beneath your reactions, beneath your exhaustion. A problem so quiet you might have mistaken it for your personality. And once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. The hidden problem isn't that life is hard. The hidden problem is that your mind treats everything as if it's life or death, even when it isn't. And because of that, you spend your days defending a version of yourself that doesn't even exist outside your thoughts. Think about it. A delayed reply can feel like rejection. A stranger's expression can feel like judgment. A small mistake can feel like a prophecy. Your brain doesn't just observe events, it interprets them, stamps them with meaning, and then punishes or rewards you based on a story it invented in a fraction of a second. Marcus Aurelius would call this the moment you mistake the impression for reality. The Stoics believed that events are neutral until your mind paints them. The insult is only an insult when you agree it is. The setback is only a setback when you label it one. The fear is only fear when you obey it. And that idea sounds simple until you realize how violently your mind resists it. Because the mind doesn't want truth. The mind wants certainty. It wants control. It wants protection. And protection is where the trap begins. Carl Jung described a part of you that you hide, not just from others but from yourself. He called it the shadow. The rejected emotions, the unacceptable desires, the weakness you pretend you've outgrown, the rage you dress up as being honest, the envy you rename as standards, the insecurity you disguise as superiority. The shadow isn't evil. It's unintegrated. It's energy you refuse to look at, so it learned to operate in the dark. And when something triggers that darkness, you don't respond, you react. That's what most people call personality. But it's not personality. It's programming. A boss criticizes you, and suddenly you're not hearing feedback. You're reliving a childhood moment where approval felt like oxygen. A partner distances themselves, and suddenly you're not dealing with a relationship. You're wrestling abandonment. A friend outshines you, and suddenly you're not seeing their success. You're feeling your own worth evaporate. This is why self-mastery is so rare. Because self-mastery demands you admit something humiliating. Your greatest enemy is not the world. It is the part of you that panics inside the world. Nietzsche would press the blade deeper. Most people don't even live by their own values. They live by inherited values, social values, values they absorb the way a child absorbs a parent's fear. They don't choose what matters. They're trained into what matters. Status, approval, comfort, entertainment, the illusion of being right. So when those things are threatened, they don't feel challenged. They feel annihilated. That's why a simple disagreement can ignite a war. That's why criticism can feel like violence. That's why being ignored can feel like death. Because the ego, the constructed self you carry around, depends on external confirmation to stay alive. And here comes the philosophical poison. If your identity is built on what other people think, then other people own you. You might call it confidence, but it's actually a lease. You might call it self-esteem, but it's actually a hostage situation. Schopenhauer saw something bleak but precise. Human beings are driven by a restless wanting, a hunger that moves from one object to the next, never satisfied for long. You finally get the thing you craved and feel relief for 5 minutes. Then emptiness returns, and you need something else to chase to avoid the silence. And modern society, with the elegance of a machine, has learned to monetize that hunger. It sells you distraction as if it's peace. It sells you stimulation as if it's meaning. It sells you consumption as if it's identity. Aldous Huxley warned that the future wouldn't be controlled by force alone, but by pleasure, by endless seduction, endless entertainment, endless noise. Not a prison with bars, but a prison with comforts. A cage you refuse to leave because leaving would require you to face your own mind without anesthesia. So you scroll, you binge, you refresh, you check. Not because you're curious, but because silence feels too sharp. And then Sartre enters the room like a cold wind. He insisted that you are condemned to be free, meaning you are responsible whether you like it or not. Even refusing responsibility is a choice. Even surrendering is a decision. Yet most people spend their lives trying to escape this freedom, because freedom demands you stop blaming the world for what you haven't confronted in yourself. That's why people cling to excuses like religion clings to rituals. I'm just an anxious person. I'm just hot-tempered. I'm just not motivated. I'm just unlucky in love. Those statements feel like identity, but they're often surrender dressed as self-knowledge. Viktor Frankl, who stared into the abyss of human suffering, offered a line that feels like a key sliding into a lock. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space lies your freedom. In that space lies your power. But here's the hidden problem: most people never enter that space. They live as reflexes. The nervous system flares, then action. The ego is threatened, then defense. The craving appears, then indulgence. The fear whispers, then retreat. So the external world becomes a remote control, and every mood swing proves it. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself as if he were disciplining a wild animal, not with hatred, almost with weary compassion. As if he knew, you will be tempted to become petty. You will be tempted to become outraged. You will be tempted to chase what is cheap. And he kept returning to the same core insight: you don't control what happens. You control what you do with it. Now pause and look at your daily life through that lens. How many of your problems are actually events, and how many are interpretations you never questioned? How often do you suffer not because life struck you, but because your mind insisted the strike meant something about your worth? And here's the part that should unsettle you. If your emotions are always determined by what happens outside you, then you are not living, you are being lived. That is the philosophical root. You are outsourcing your inner authority. You are allowing the crowd, the culture, your past, your impulses, anything loud enough, to decide what you feel, what you do, and who you are. And the longer that happens, the more your true self becomes a stranger, watching from behind glass while your reactive self runs the show. But this still isn't the worst part, because the hidden problem doesn't stay contained in your mind like a private storm. It leaks into your choices, your relationships, your ambitions. It shapes the entire architecture of your life. It quietly builds a reality around you, one reaction at a time, until you wake up inside a life that looks fine, but feels like captivity. And if you think that's dramatic, wait until you see what it's doing to you without your permission. At first, the consequences look ordinary. They wear everyday disguises: fatigue, irritability, procrastination, overthinking, just being busy. Nothing that sounds like a crisis. Nothing that would make you sit up and shout, "Something is wrong with me." That's why the trap works. Because the unseen consequences of an unmastered self don't arrive like a tornado. They arrive like fog. They soften the edges of your ambition. They blur your sense of purpose. They lower the ceiling of what you believe you can endure. And slowly, almost politely, they train you to live smaller than your potential while convincing you it's simply realistic. Start with the most overlooked consequence. Your attention becomes fragmented, not just distracted, fractured. You can feel it when you try to read a page and your mind keeps sliding away. When you sit with someone you love and part of you is already elsewhere. When you begin a task and instantly reach for something, anything, to relieve the discomfort of focus. This isn't a moral failure, it's conditioning. Your brain learns what you repeatedly reward, and modern life rewards novelty like a drug. Every notification is a slot machine lever. Every scroll is a new chance at stimulation. Dopamine isn't pleasure, as people casually say, it's anticipation. It's the chemical that whispers, maybe the next thing will be better. So your mind becomes a hunter. But it hunts without direction. It chases micro-rewards all day, likes, messages, updates, quick wins, and then collapses at night feeling empty because it spent its life force on crumbs. You may not notice it as tragedy because everyone around you is doing the same thing, so it feels normal. But what happens to a person who cannot hold attention? They cannot hold a plan. They cannot hold a value. They cannot hold a vision. They become easy to steer, not by villains but by whatever is loudest, newest, most provocative. And the more reactive your attention becomes, the harder it is to enter the Stoic space Frankl described, the space between stimulus and response. That space shrinks until it's almost non-existent. Then comes the next consequence. Your emotions become a management problem. You don't feel emotions, you handle them. You negotiate with them, fear them, suppress them, vent them, distract from them. You build routines and habits not to grow, but to avoid what you might feel if you slowed down. And because you never fully process your emotions, they start controlling you from the basement. Cognitive science has a word for part of this: negativity bias. Your brain evolved to prioritize threats because, in the wild, missing danger meant death. So it scans for problems automatically. In the modern world, that scanning doesn't turn off. It just latches onto social threats, status threats, identity threats. A raised eyebrow becomes a threat. A slow reply becomes a threat. Someone else's success becomes a threat. You might think you're reacting to reality, but often you're reacting to a primitive alarm system interpreting symbols as predators. And the more you obey that system, the more it rewires you. Your default becomes vigilance. Your baseline becomes tension. Your mind becomes a security guard in an empty museum, patrolling halls that aren't under attack. Now look at what this does to your relationships. When you're not self-mastered, you don't relate to people as they are. You relate to what they trigger in you. Someone disappoints you, and instead of addressing it cleanly, you punish them with silence because your ego wants revenge disguised as boundaries. Someone challenges you, and instead of listening, you become defensive because your identity needs to stay intact. Someone gets close, and instead of receiving love, you become suspicious because intimacy threatens your control. You may call it standards, but often it's fear in expensive clothing. So the relationship becomes a stage where two nervous systems negotiate safety, not two souls building something real. And because most people are also reactive, the smallest friction turns into a war of interpretation. You're not arguing about the dishes. You're arguing about respect. You're not arguing about time. You're arguing about being valued. You're not arguing about the tone of a message. You're arguing about your worth. Each person fights to protect their ego and calls it love. Then comes the consequence most people refuse to name. Your life becomes a collection of avoidance strategies. Procrastination is rarely laziness. It's often emotional avoidance. The task threatens your identity. What if I try and I'm not good enough? The phone becomes a sedative. The snack becomes a sedative. The later becomes a sedative. Perfectionism is the same. Not high standards, but fear of judgment. If you never finish, you never get evaluated. If you never commit, you never risk rejection. If you never begin, you can fantasize safely inside potential where nothing can hurt you. This is how people die without dying. They remain alive biologically but never fully enter their own life, because entering would require confronting discomfort without escape. And here's where cultural conditioning makes the trap almost inescapable. Because the culture rewards appearances more than essence. It rewards confidence displays more than internal stability. It rewards outrage more than clarity. It rewards speed more than depth. It rewards reaction more than reflection. So reactivity becomes socially reinforced. Your anger gets applause. Your hot takes get attention. Your constant availability gets praised as hustle. Your inability to sit with yourself gets reframed as being driven. And you never notice that you're being trained. Trained to outsource your worth. Trained to crave validation. Trained to fear stillness. Trained to live with an always-on nervous system. The result? A society of people who are technically free, yet psychologically chained to impulses, approval, and constant noise. Now bring it back down to your day today. How many choices did you make because you believed in them? And how many because you were trying to escape a feeling? How many times did your mood change because of something trivial, and you treated it as truth? How many times did you shrink, hesitate, perform, posture, overthink? Because you were unconsciously protecting an ego that is always hungry and never satisfied. Marcus Aurelius would say, "You have confused what is yours with what is not yours. Your body is yours to care for. Your values are yours to choose. Your judgments are yours to discipline. But the opinions of others, the unpredictability of life, the random disruptions, the petty behavior of strangers, those were never yours to control. Yet you keep trying, and that effort drains you more than the events themselves. This is the unseen consequence. You waste your life force fighting the uncontrollable while neglecting the one realm where power is real, your own mind. And when you live that way, daily life becomes exhausting because you're not only living your life, you're also constantly reacting to it, resisting it, narrating it, defending yourself from it. You become a person at war with reality. But there is a moment, sometimes quiet, sometimes violent, when a person finally gets tired of being controlled, not by other people, by their own reflexes. That is where rebellion begins. Not rebellion against the world, but against the part of you that keeps surrendering to the world. And once you decide to rebel, you realize something chilling and liberating. The prison door was never locked. You were just trained to forget you had hands. Rebellion doesn't begin with motivation. It begins with disgust. A clean, quiet disgust at the realization that you've been living like a puppet with golden strings, pulled by moods, pulled by cravings, pulled by other people's approval, pulled by the invisible pressure to perform. You don't rebel because you suddenly feel strong. You rebel because you finally see how weak it is to live as a reaction. And the moment you see it, you can't unsee it. Marcus Aurelius didn't write his thoughts as decoration. He wrote them the way a man grips a blade in the dark, not to look noble, but to survive his own mind. Imagine being surrounded by power, luxury, influence, and still waking up every day to the same enemy. Irritation, ego, fear, vanity, grief, temptation. He knew something most people refuse to learn. You don't master yourself once. You master yourself repeatedly, at the exact moment you want to surrender. So here is the rebellion, not as a slogan but as a practice. It starts with a radical shift. Stop treating your emotions as commands. Feelings arrive with authority. Anger says attack. Fear says retreat. Craving says consume. Shame says hide, but emotions are not rulers. They are signals, messengers, weather. You wouldn't let a storm decide your identity. So why let a mood decide your behavior? This is what the Stoics meant by governing the ruling faculty, the part of you that chooses. The world can flood you with stimuli, but it cannot force your judgment unless you hand over the keys. And yes, it will feel unnatural at first, because you've been trained to act instantly, trained to treat internal tension like an emergency. The rebellion is learning to endure the heat of an impulse without obeying it. That is the first skill, delay. A short pause that changes everything. When you're provoked, pause. When you're tempted, pause. When you're anxious, pause. Not to repress the feeling, but to reclaim the space between stimulus and response. That space is where freedom lives. The pause is where you stop being an animal and start being an author. Most people don't fail because they lack intelligence. They fail because they lack interruption. They never interrupt the old pattern. Now the second skill is even more brutal. Name the story. Your suffering is often not caused by the event. It's caused by the story your mind attaches to the event. Marcus Aurelius would ask, "What is this, objectively? Not what does it mean, not what does it imply, not what does it say about you, what is it?" A delayed message is a delayed message. A criticism is a set of words. A setback is an outcome, not a verdict. The rebellion is stripping reality of the theatrical meaning your ego adds. Because the ego narrates in extremes, this always happens to me. They don't respect me. I'm behind in life. If I fail once, it means I'm a failure. These are not facts. They are identity spells. And if you keep repeating them, you will live inside them. So name it. I'm telling myself a story right now. That sentence is a knife. It cuts you free. Then comes the third skill, the one that feels like standing naked in front of your own mind. Voluntary discomfort. This is where self-mastery stops being mindset and becomes training. You don't become sovereign by reading quotes. You become sovereign by rehearsing hardship on purpose, so hardship doesn't own you when it arrives uninvited. Cold showers, long walks without headphones, fasting, training when you don't feel like it, saying no when you crave approval, speaking the truth when silence is easier, leaving comfort before it turns into addiction. This is not self-punishment. It's self-liberation, because comfort can become a soft drug, one that dulls you into dependence, and dependence is the opposite of freedom. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that everything he loved was temporary, not to become cold, but to become clear. The rebellion is practicing detachment before life forces detachment on you. When you can face discomfort willingly, you stop negotiating with reality like a coward. You stop begging the world to be gentle. You become the kind of person who can endure. Now the fourth skill is the hardest because it threatens your identity. Stop performing. Start living. Most people are actors. Even when they're alone, they're still performing for an imaginary audience, for future judgment, for the ghost of someone they needed approval from. They craft their opinions for acceptance. They shape their personality for reward. They hide their truth to avoid rejection. But performance is exhausting because it requires constant calculation. The rebellion is becoming internally anchored, deciding who you are before the world reacts. That means choosing values that don't depend on applause, integrity over image, discipline over mood, courage over comfort, clarity over being liked. And yes, this will cost you. It will cost you shallow approval. It will cost you some relationships built on your compliance. It will cost you the illusion that you can please everyone and still belong. But the trade is brutal and beautiful. You exchange external validation for internal authority. Now, here's where the rebellion becomes practical in daily life. When you wake up, you're not just waking up. You're choosing what kind of mind will govern your day. So you build a morning ritual that is not about productivity, but about sovereignty. A few minutes of silence before screens. A question, what is within my control today? A reminder, other people's reactions are not my responsibility. A commitment, I will not trade my peace for something petty. Then throughout the day, you practice micro-rebellions. When someone tries to bait you into drama, you refuse. When your mind tries to catastrophize, you return to facts. When you feel the itch to escape discomfort, you stay. When you want to complain, you act instead. These are small choices, but they compound into a new identity. And here's the most counterintuitive part. Self-mastery doesn't make you less emotional. It makes you less possessed. You still feel anger, but it doesn't drive. You still feel fear, but it doesn't rule. You still feel desire, but it doesn't command. You become a human being with a spine, not rigid, not numb, but aligned. And when you live aligned, daily life changes. Not because the world becomes kinder, but because you stop needing it to be. You stop bargaining with reality. You stop begging for certainty. You stop collapsing when things don't go your way. You don't become invincible. You become ungovernable. And now we arrive at the edge of the final door, the one most people avoid their whole lives because behind it is the ultimate truth. A truth so sharp it makes everything else, your anxiety, your overthinking, your constant hunger for more, suddenly look like symptoms of one misunderstanding. Because the deepest rebellion isn't against discomfort, it's against illusion. Imagine the last moment of your life. Not the cinematic version, not the poetic version, but the quiet, clinical reality. The body slowing down, the room narrowing, the noise of the world fading like a radio losing signal. And in that moment, something terrifying becomes simple. You don't care about the arguments you won. You don't care about the status you performed for. You don't care about the image you tried to maintain. What remains is a single question, one that has been waiting behind every decision you've ever made. Did you live as yourself, or did you live as a reaction? Most people never ask this until it's too late, because asking it forces a reckoning. How much of your life has been surrendered to forces you pretended were unavoidable? Moods, fears, cravings, other people's opinions. The invisible social gravity that pulls you towards safety and sameness. Marcus Aurelius wrote like someone who had already rehearsed that final room in his mind. Not because he was morbid, but because he understood a truth that turns the world inside out. Death is not the tragedy. Unconscious living is the tragedy. And unconscious living is seductive because it feels like comfort. It feels like going with the flow. It feels like avoiding conflict. It feels like staying busy. But what it really is, if you strip away the euphemisms, is the slow trade of your inner authority for temporary relief. You trade your truth for peace. You trade your focus for distraction. You trade your courage for approval. You trade your time for numbness. And the bill always arrives. Here is the ultimate realization, the one that changes the meaning of winning completely. You are not primarily here to control life. You are here to meet life with a mind that cannot be owned. That's what mastery is. Not domination of the world, but liberation from dependence on it. Because the world is unstable by design. People are inconsistent. Circumstances change. Plans collapse. Bodies age. The crowd forgets you. Even your own mind on some days turns against you for no apparent reason. So if your peace depends on the world behaving, you will never be at peace. That is the trap. You've been trying to build a stable inner life on an unstable outer foundation. Stoicism is not emotionless. It is architecture, it says. Build the foundation where the earthquake can't reach. And that foundation is your judgment. The meaning you assign, the perspective you adopt, the values you refuse to betray, the inner stance you take toward whatever arrives. Now listen carefully, because this is the point where most people misunderstand self-mastery. They think self-mastery is about becoming better, more disciplined, more productive, more impressive. But the deepest self-mastery is something else. It is the shift from being a character in your mind's story to being the one who watches the story. The moment you can watch your thoughts without obeying them, you become dangerous, in the best way. You watch insecurity arise like a shadow and you don't worship it. You watch anger flare like fire and you don't throw gasoline on it. You watch craving beg like a child and you don't hand it the keys. You become the witness. And when you become the witness, a haunting truth reveals itself. So much of your suffering was not life hurting you. It was your mind insisting reality should be different. Your ego demanding control. Your fear demanding certainty. Your pride demanding respect. Your appetite demanding comfort. That insistence is what exhausts you. The pain might be unavoidable, but the extra suffering, the spiraling, the resentment, the catastrophizing, the self-hatred, that part often comes from one invisible belief. I shouldn't have to endure this. Marcus Aurelius would say, yes, you should, not as punishment, as nature. Rain falls, people disappoint, plans fail, bodies break. Time moves forward like a blade that does not negotiate. So the real question is not, how do I make life stop testing me? The real question is, who do I become while life tests me? That is the final arena. And when you live from that question, something strange happens. You stop chasing winning as a desperate attempt to prove your worth. You start living as if your worth is already settled, because it no longer depends on outcomes. You can pursue goals without being consumed by them. You can face failure without it becoming identity. You can be disliked without collapsing. You can be alone without feeling abandoned, because your inner center becomes non-negotiable. Now here's the cinematic part, the part that should feel like a door opening in your chest. When you master yourself, daily life becomes a training ground for freedom. A rude stranger becomes practice. A stressful meeting becomes practice. A temptation becomes practice. A loss becomes practice. Not because you're numb, but because you understand the difference between what happens and what you make it mean. And suddenly, the world's chaos stops feeling like a curse and starts feeling like a forge. Every day gives you thousands of chances to become the kind of person who cannot be dragged around by the invisible leash of impulse. That is what Marcus Aurelius meant when he wrote that the impediment to action advances action, that what stands in the way becomes the way. The obstacle isn't merely something to suffer through. It is the very thing shaping your strength if you let it. Now step back and look at your life one last time from this height. How many moments did you lose because you were mentally elsewhere? How many opportunities did you miss because you needed certainty before courage? How many relationships did you poison because your ego wanted to be right more than it wanted to be real? And then ask the question that will either terrify you or set you free. What would your life look like if you stopped abandoning yourself? If you stopped trading your peace for trivial battles? If you stopped letting people rent space in your mind for free? If you stopped obeying every emotion like it was a law? If you stopped living as a hostage to your own reactions? Because here is the ultimate truth in one line. The person you are becoming is created in the moments you think don't matter. Not the grand speeches, not the big wins, but the micro decisions to pause instead of snap, to act instead of delay, to endure instead of escape, to choose your values instead of your cravings. That's the quiet rebellion. And if you commit to it, something almost frightening happens. You stop needing life to be easy. You become capable. And capability is the rarest form of confidence, because it doesn't require anyone's permission. So when you wake up tomorrow and life offers the same old triggers, the same old chaos, the same old temptations, you won't ask, "How do I avoid this?" You'll ask, "How do I use this?" And you will begin to live like a sovereign being inside a world that tries every day to make you a servant, not by force, by seduction, but you will see the seduction now. And once you see it, you can finally choose, not the life that looks impressive, the life that is yours.